The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, here as always with Steve Gazella, president of the Massing Polling Group, and it is Thursday, September 4th. Today, we're talking about the Trump administration turning much more aggressively toward Boston, one of the Democratic-led cities that has drawn his ire for its immigration policy, its approach to climate resiliency, its law enforcement stances, and its just general blue nature. So, let's get into it. Before we get into kind of the dynamic between federal powers and state powers and city powers, let's talk about some intra-state fighting here, the kind that we endorse, the kind that we approve of, and that's just your good old-fashioned elections.
That's right, Jen. Next week is the Boston preliminary election, not one that's drawn a ton of attention just because the polling has been so wide and it's generally assumed that Michelle Wu is going to win by a lot, and because Michelle Wu and Josh Kraft are almost definitely going to get through to the final, which means that we're going to have September through November to talk about the matchup if it does at some point heat up. So that's why it hasn't really been an issue. A huge issue that's been on our minds so far is just because there haven't been a lot of fireworks, but maybe that'll change.
I do think this is a good time for our semi-regular reminder that Boston is one of the cities with nonpartisan elections. So in some ways, that makes it a little bit harder for candidates to distinguish themselves without the coding of the Democrat next to their name. There's been a little bit of chuckling about Josh Kraft noting that he's a Democrat for mayor, which is essentially the only person that Boston elects for mayor, even though you don't even get to put it next to your name.
That's right. And just to remind people, if you are a new horse race listener, basically what it means to have nonpartisan municipal elections is everybody runs on one big ballot that will be cast next week. And then the top two vote getters from that will go through to November, which we assume will be Michelle Wu and Josh Kraft. And then we'll have basically a mini campaign during that period.
That's right. Well, that's about our roundup for now on that. We'll be much more thorough next week when we actually have a sense of how the only polling that matters, the actual election, I'm kidding, Steve, actually ends up panning out.
I think you just said polling doesn't matter. I think if I'm reading the subtext there, that was just like a cheap shot. Just from,
come and get me from Kenya, space. I dare you.
Anyway, yes, we have our good friend Kelly Garrity here to talk about why the Trump administration seems to be obsessed with Boston and Massachusetts in general. So, Jen, giddy up.
If you insist.
Boston looks to be next on the list of the Trump administration's occupation of American cities. We've seen Marines in Los Angeles, an alphabet soup of armed agents on the streets of D.C., and ICE seemingly everywhere. Now, as Politico reports, it looks like Boston could see a new wave of armed agents conducting what the Trump administration is claiming to be immigration enforcement operations. Here to talk us through the details, we have our good friend Kelly Garrity, author of Politico's Massachusetts Playbook. Kelly, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
As you and others have reported, the Trump administration seems in many ways obsessed with Massachusetts, but let's start with what's new this week, which is this idea that there's going to be ramped up immigration enforcement in Boston. What are they saying and what should we expect?
So one of my colleagues, one of our White House reporters at Politico, reported over the weekend that there could soon be a surge in immigration officials in Boston. The president actually talked about this on Tuesday. Chicago seems like it's sort of the first target for the White House, and Trump confirmed Tuesday that he plans to send National Guard troops to Chicago. He didn't give a timeline for this, but it evoked a pretty strong response from Illinois officials. The governor there was talking about it, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. And then Axios also reported on Wednesday morning that an immigration official actually told Axios that Chicago and Boston crackdowns could happen soon. So we don't know exactly what the timing of this is going to look like at this point. But it does seem like there is going to be some sort of operation happening in the Boston area imminently.
And this is happening, of course, in the context of what we have seen in Los Angeles. So, kind of as some background here, of course, the president had said that he wanted to essentially ramp up deportations to a level basically unheard of in the recent tax bill. It came with billions of dollars in new funding for ICE. That has looked very strange in Los Angeles for a lot of the people out there because, of course, as we saw, immigration enforcement was targeting places like Home Depots and kind of grabbing people in what seemed like a haphazard way because they have been trying to meet these very specific quotas that have been offered by the Trump administration. And regardless of the quotas, they've been having trouble meeting those administration requirements and projections. In Los Angeles, this has resulted in protests, objection from the governor because it involved nationalizing the state National Guard, which, as we've talked about before, is a pretty unusual move over the objection of the governor. So, what have you been watching in the reaction to Los Angeles that might inform what states like Massachusetts or Illinois could expect? It doesn't seem like they're waiting to see if all of the courts sign off on whether or not this is legal before making moves.
Right, so that's actually that's one of the things that officials keep saying when they're asked about the potential for these crackdowns happening in their state. They say they're going to turn to the courts for recourse here, but obviously this is all happening so fast. A lot of the time the courts are a little bit behind. But I do think, kind of like what you mentioned with the protests that we saw in Los Angeles, there's definitely sort of that feeling in Boston, and I think some of that has been sort of led by the mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu. She's given a very strong response whenever she's asked about the potential for crackdowns in the city. Last month, the Attorney General Pam Bondi sent letters to a bunch of cities and states that the White House had kind of deemed sanctuary cities or sanctuary states. And the mayor in responding to that letter, she held a huge press conference at City Hall that kind of had the vibe of, I mean, she's also on the ballot right now, right? So that it kind of had the vibe of almost a campaign rally for her. But it's people in Boston have seemed to mobilize around this in opposition to this. So I think that I who knows what it will actually look like when it happens, what the response will be, but already we're kind of seeing a lot of that resistance.
And it seems, in a way, just to put this in broader context for a second, that Massachusetts is just holding a lot of space in the Trump administration's, we'll call it their collective brain. You mentioned Mayor Michelle Wu. Of course, we've also got Maura Healey and Andrea Campbell pushing back very strongly, both actually during this administration. And in the case of Governor Healey, when she was Attorney General, even all the way back to the first Trump administration. So how much of this, just to put it right out there, is this is a blue state, and even though crime is much lower in Boston than it is many other places, including lots of red states, we can just go harass cities with lots of Democrats in them, put armed agents everywhere, and, kind of whip up a scene. Like, is that any part of this, or could we even see this as a legitimate exercise in just immigration enforcement that the Trump administration is kind of portraying it as?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point that you bring up, Steve. Something that the mayor always talks about is the crime rate in Boston, and she's typically using the murder rate in the city has gone down significantly in the past couple of years. And so whenever this sort of comes up, she describes Boston as the safest major city in the country. So there does seem to be some sort of discrepancy there. Obviously, there's that murder isn't the only type of crime that can happen in a city, and data for other types of crimes kind of varies for Boston. But it does seem to some degree, like the administration has a very heavy focus on a lot of these cities. You see Chicago, New York, and Boston. All the mayors had to testify before the House Oversight Committee, the Republican-controlled House Oversight Committee. Earlier this year. So it does seem like there's a heavy focus on some pretty distinctly blue or Democrat-led cities.
I'm glad you brought up the testimony side of things too, because it's really been kind of a rolling process. Of course, the language around sanctuary cities or sanctuary states, because Massachusetts, unlike California, doesn't have statewide specific legislation around what kind of cooperation there can be with immigration enforcement, though we do have a Supreme Judicial Court ruling that does make it clear that there can be some limits there. But cities like Boston have versions of what in Boston is called the Trust Act, basically saying that local police are limited in how much they can cooperate with ICE just to, for instance, pursue immigration enforcement actions. You aren't supposed to be handing over information or people essentially to immigration enforcement if that's the only reason that the federal government is interested in them, essentially. So when Michelle Wu went to Congress, and I'm also glad that you noted that this is happening in the context of a re-election campaign, there is this sort of presentation of civic pride about Boston's commitments to its people and its processes. But what was interesting to me that's been noted in a few of these articles is that the perspective of the Wu administration is essentially that this is a retaliatory threat coming from the Trump administration, that it's, as Steve noted, not specifically tethered to specifics of crime rates, but that it is an effort to essentially bring the city to heel. And that's certainly how California has responded to similar moves. So what is Michelle Wu's opponent responding with here? Is it kind of, if you're running for mayor of Boston, everybody's kind of walking the same line, or is there error between them in the way that they're responding to these claims about Boston's safety?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting thing to kind of look at here. There's a handful of people who are running against Michelle Wu this cycle. Obviously, the most prominent one is Josh Kraft, and he has said that he supports the Boston Trust Act. I mean, it politically it kind of makes sense. It's been polled and it's popular among people in the city. And one of the points that the mayor makes as well is that the Trust Act, which was actually, I believe it was passed when Marty Walsh was mayor. But she says that it makes the city safer because people are actually feel comfortable working with or feel comfortable around safety officials, whether it's Boston police or whatnot in the city. So it's easier to keep the crime rate down.
And I do want to note as well, speaking of LA, which right now, as the only city aside from Washington, D.C., which is kind of a unique case because, of course, the president has relatively unusual amounts of control over the capital of the country because it's not its own state. It doesn't have its own representation. There's a more kind of bound up connection between the D.C. police force and federal agencies over there. So looking at LA right now, what's been interesting to watch on the court side of it is the question of whether or not the president overstepped his actual authority to say, if I believe that there is a safety risk, if I believe there's a public safety and immigration risk, if there's protests, if there's kind of large-scale public endangerment or something that looks like large-scale public endangerment from my perspective, I can send National Guard troops in. And so a California district judge just yesterday, we're recording on Wednesday, said that Trump actually violated the act that limits the power of the federal government to use military force for domestic matters. So, of course, that's going to be challenged. Of course, the president has said that he does not agree with that ruling. His spokespeople have said that you essentially have a rogue nation of judges trying to act as commander-in-chief and overthink the president's authority. But part of the context here is that we are sort of waiting to see how this plays out. This ruling itself is on hold until the 12th of September. We don't yet know what the ultimate appeals process is going to look like. there's been a very mixed set of results from the US Supreme Court so far, a lot of the time saying we're going to hold off on our decisions on this until these cases work their way through the lower courts. So, is there a sense, Kelly, that there is still uncertainty, not just in terms of will the president send National Guard troops out, but to what extent would the cities and towns be expected to cooperate or be expected to kind of open their doors to these Guard troops?
Yeah, I think uncertainty is sort of the big theme here. Is we just don't know what this is going to look like, because of, for a city like Boston, because of the Trust Act. Boston police officers are limited in the ways that they actually are allowed to assist in anything that would be some sort of immigration enforcement uh, proceeding, I guess, or surge. And so it is just, I don't think that we'll really know what it would look like until it actually happens. Just because it's because of what you're talking about with the court process, that's going to take so long to play out. Any sort of recourse that cities have there, they probably won't really have until months down the line, right? So.
And it's also worth noting, of course, that Trump is famous and always has been for making court proceedings take forever and appealing every possible little wrinkle and challenging everything and changing venues and challenging judges and so forth and so on. So I think what's probably most reasonable to expect is that the courts won't really have a timely say on this issue unless something is very different than it has been in the past. Kelly, I also wanted to bring in another issue which may involve the federal government basically trying to take over something that Boston manages, which is South Station. Of course, in D.C., they have taken a much larger role in Union Station, which at least they own. But they're also now apparently interested in elbowing their way into management of South Station. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so this was a couple weeks ago, I believe. Some officials from the White House came down and said that South Station could be sort of the next location for an operation like the one that's playing out in DC. Obviously, like you guys have mentioned, DC, the government, it's a very different situation there. So it is just kind of hard to tell what that would look like. Or I mean, a lot of times too, it's hard to know, I guess, sometimes how imminent or how immediately serious some of these officials are about a lot of these things that are playing out. Like if you look at what the president said about sending National Guard troops to Chicago, he said we're going in, but he explicitly said I didn't give a timeline for when we're going to do it. So it kind of just uh, obviously, I know that Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker said that they're preparing for it. In Boston, Mayor Michelle Wu has said we're preparing for surges like this, but it's just unclear what it would look like. And I think there were a handful of pieces too. I know WBUR interviewed some commuters in Boston. I saw a lot of stuff on social media about this, but people seem to feel pretty safe going through South Station, at least sort of the people that were interviewed for some of those pieces. So I think that's kind of an interesting piece there too, is how much people feel like this is something that actually needs to happen. Any kind of enforcement, safety enforcement at a place like this, like South Station.
And we've talked about Mayor Michelle Wu, but where has Governor Healy kind of been on this? She, I believe, referred to the claims around South Station as political theater and political power grabs. What's her position been so far on the question of whether or not the president would try and, as he did in California, basically take over the traditional role of the governor as commander in chief of the state National Guard?
She she has definitely been sort of kind of falling along the lines of this is just things that don't seem to be legal. But a lot of times she kind of turns the conversation to why is this even something that the White House is focusing on right now? She kind of turns it back on President Trump said when he was running that he was going to focus on affordability, making bringing costs down for people. why is this instead what we're paying attention to?
We should also say right here that crime at South Station is actually quite low, as reported today in the Boston Globe. Definitely take a look at the stats there. They're even down from past years, and the stuff that we're talking about is violent and property crime, which is down 16% from the year before. And we've got 22 total incidents reported so far this year. The Globe also did a bit of public service journalism, reporting out what people called 311 about at South Station. And here is what people are concerned about. It's parking enforcement, the needle program, highway maintenance, street cleaning, and signals. So I don't know. It seems like an odd choice to come invade South Station, but here we are.
And we've been very focused, obviously, on the conflict between state and city Democrats versus sort of a federal Republican administration. But we do have a Republican Party here in Massachusetts. The fact that on a federal level, it's so limited in that there are zero, count them zero, Congress people or senators currently in Massachusetts who are Republicans. And that's actually also drawn the ire of the Trump administration, who's claiming that that is essentially tomfoolery around redistricting. All of this is to say, how are the Republicans in Massachusetts responding to these claims from the Trump administration? Do they also say, crime is out of control and South Station is full of dangerous people and not just dangerous pigeons?
I think a lot of the Republican Party's focus and a lot of Republican elected officials or Republican candidates, they have been paying a lot of attention to the migrant surge that Massachusetts has seen in recent years. And obviously there's been some very high profile cases of crime there. And so they have definitely been leaning on that. And I think that's sort of, especially if you look at the governor's race that's coming up in 2026 and you see a couple of the candidates there who are talking about migrants and migration in Massachusetts all the time and about how the cost of that. And then on top of that, just some of the cases of crime that have occurred. And then if you go way back when we were talking about quarries and whether or not people who are going into the state's shelter system were getting background checks, that's definitely been something that Republicans want to talk about because they feel like it's a winning issue for them here. Yeah, but essentially, Republicans sort of view immigration and crime as tied and as an issue that they can campaign on. I also think it's kind of interesting to see the difference of how that's playing out, sort of at the state level. If you look at Republicans who are running for governor in Massachusetts, whereas if you look at in the mayoral race, it hasn't really become this wedge issue because it's just such a different electorate.
And I will say that immigration has grown in priority in recent years. When we have done polls on what people's top priorities are, immigration is now more important than it was maybe 5 years ago. It has faded a little bit. It kind of went through probably its highest level of importance, during I guess the highest points, the peaks of the migrant crisis that we had here, and kind of when the shelters were the most full and stuff before the state really got its feet under it. I have not seen any polling, though I would hazard a guess that if you try to translate that to, and therefore should we send thousands of armed, federal agents from all different agencies and post them around Boston, you're going to get quite a different response. But I should do the polling. So maybe we'll find a way to do that polling sometime soon.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask kind of on that note, Steve, because when we've talked about polling around these enforcement actions before, you often see a pretty big gap between people saying that they generally support the idea of having changes to the immigration system or the common language around, the worst of the worst, that sort of thing. But then when you kind of narrow down into, well, does this look like we're arresting or deporting people whose primary violation was solely an immigration one, but otherwise, exist in these communities, then that favorability drops quite a bit. If I'm recalling the polling correctly, please check me.
No, that's correct. And I think it's also just worth saying that the polling on anything that's directly tied to Trump is uniformly terrible in Massachusetts. I mean, it's always 35, 36, 37%, something like that, maybe 40%. Or if it's something that people like anyway and Trump were to decide to do it, I guess it could be higher than that. But I would not expect that the translation would work, that just because we've seen lots of migrants coming into Massachusetts, therefore there will be support for these, very drastic, very different levels of activity than we've seen any time in recent history, if ever.
And Kelly, how is that kind of dissonance showing up in internal party politics here, if at all? Is the idea that being a Democrat in Massachusetts or being a Republican in Massachusetts defined by the relationship to or opposition to the federal government's moves right now? Because there have been pretty direct shots taken by the federal government at many of the institutions that are core to the Massachusetts economy. So thinking about education, where Harvard is one of the Ivy League schools that has so far resisted making concessions to the administration. And of course, it's interesting for people who pay attention to academia to be like, how did Harvard end up being that particular institution? But you've got that. You've got broader concern over changes to health practices when the other major part of our economy is focused around biotech and medicine. So how is this actually looking on a state policy level? Is that something that locals think they have any tools to address or combat, or is the idea just be as loud and annoyed about it as possible?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing. And I think honestly, we're still sort of seeing that play out. The the state senate, obviously, the state legislature is overwhelmingly Democratic in Massachusetts. The state senate has been trying to. They have response 2025 is what they're calling it, where they're trying to push some policies that basically they're saying are policies that they can laws that they can strengthen in Massachusetts, sort of in their view, that would protect people from what they view as harms that could come from policies coming out of federal government or the White House. So far, that's been a little bit slow moving, so it's still kind of hard to see exactly how that's going to play out and whether there's going to be a really strong partisan divide on a lot of these issues. But it's also in Massachusetts, it's hard to be a Republican a little bit because the party it's a pretty small group of people who are currently elected Republicans. And obviously the voter base it's mostly people who aren't registered with a party, but it does tend to lean more towards the left than the right. So even if you live even if you're an elected Republican, there's always a risk of competition from a Democratic candidate. So it does kind of get a little complicated when there's certain issues that, okay, maybe people like you as a Republican because of your economic policies or because you've been great for your community or whatever, but they still aren't necessarily fans of the Trump administration.
All right. Well, no doubt more drama to come between the Trump administration and what they have apparently chosen as their favorite nemesis, the great state of Massachusetts. So, Kelly, I'm sure we'll have you back to discuss this more. But for now, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You can keep up with everything that Kelly Garrity is writing by subscribing to the Politico Massachusetts Playbook. We'll be right back.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by the Massachusetts Pageantry Department. We talked last week about the proposals for the Massachusetts state flag and seal. Part of the reason that we're rethinking the state flag and the state seals, and this has been a years-long process, is that the current seal that we have now, which is not just the seal but also on our flag, has a native figure who is central to it, as makes sense, obviously, given the history of our state, but also has an arm wielding a sword and a state motto that to many does in fact involve a threat, either implied or literal, of violence. So that was why we were going through this process to figure out a new state seal. And I will say I have no objection to the fact that there are no arms with swords on any of these. We have some final selections that are going through to round 3. And Steve, why is there not a single Duncan Cup represented?
There is not a Duncan Cup. There's also not an orca shooting lasers out of its eyes like was one of the ones that was originally submitted. Instead, what we have is we've got some interesting, some fairly tedious possibilities here, I think. Just to name a couple of things that are represented here we've got the chickadee, which is the state bird. We've got some turkey feathers. We've got, looks like a whale of some kind. Lots of 8-pointed stars representing, of course, maritime navigation and so forth. And one Mayflower, like not the ship, but the actual flower. Jen, you're grimacing. I'm sensing that these designs don't meet don't find favor with you.
Well, as I've been made aware, there are a few sort of central things that you want in a good state flag, state seal, state motto, etc. And that's that you want it to be immediately recognizable. You want it to be iconic but not overwhelming. You don't want it to be too busy. You want to make sure that every bit of the symbolism makes sense. And what I want is anarchy. And that just doesn't seem to correspond with allegedly good flag design.
So you just want to just watch the world burn, just like flying our like chaos flag over the state capitol.
We were shown a potential flag with a whale with laser eyes aimed somewhere underneath a cranberry on an extremely goth black background. I just think maybe we missed an opportunity here.
That's true. I mean, and the dinosaur carrying the Duncan Cup. So we also had some mottos. We've got some finalists for the mottos, and a couple of them are in Latin. But basically how they're translated are many voices, one commonwealth. We honor all life guided by the first light, and we rejoice in the public good. So, I don't know. Perhaps coming soon to a state house near you. Fortunately for all of you today, that is all the time we have. I'm Steve Gazella, signing off with Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Gazella. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com and tell us your unofficial state symbol. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us here at the Massing Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. For now, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.